Good afternoon and welcome to SPI Fall Protection webinar. I would like first to thank each and everyone for taking the time to attend this webinar this afternoon. My name is Valerie, Marketing Advisor for SPI Health and Safety, and I will be your host for today. For the next 45 minutes, we will go through some fall protection CSA standards, and our expert advisor will discuss how proposed changes will affect people working at AIDS. We'll have some time at the end of the webinar to answer your questions. That being said, I would like to introduce our guest speaker today, Mr. Bruce Davis. Mr. Bruce Davis holds a diploma for training adults from Tulane University, competent trainer and qualified inspector certificates from Solosky Fall Protection in collaboration with CSA. Bruce has successfully completed many training courses from several fall protection equipment manufacturers. With over 26 years of experience in occupational health and safety, Mr. Davis has many accomplishments in OHS training, and he has been involved in implementing various services tailored to the needs and realities of SPI Health and Safety customers. Without further ado, I will now pass on to my colleague, Mr. Bruce Davis.
Thank you very much, Valerie, and thank you for everyone who are listening to us this afternoon. What I'd like to do is address some changes that occurred to our CSA standards and some proposed changes that will be implemented in the future in regards to certain types of equipment. As you know, CSA, our fall protection category has a number of standards. It's a family, in fact, of standards under the Z259 designation. And these standards grow and evolve along with technological advances in equipment, also go along with perceived risks in the environment and the workplace. So our CSA standards are always evolving and trying to address these new innovations, also address risks that we perceive in our environment and our workplace. CSA standards, I kind of liken them to a quality assurance program. And that I mean that the CSA standards are there to ensure that the equipment that we're using in fall protection meet a certain criteria or a group of criteria to ensure that they perform adequately, perform exactly how they're supposed to in the event of a fall. So basically, a CSA standard basically addresses criteria of design, how equipment should be assembled, how it should be built. It also addresses performance criteria, what parameters these equipment have to encounter in the way of performance. It also discusses market identification, rather, of the equipment. And also, under certain standards, you also will also find instructive information in regards to inspections, recertifications, and whatnot in regards to the equipment. What I'd like to do today is basically address two standards. And curiously enough, the first standard that I'm going to address is actually relatively new. It's been in place now for, approximately 10 years. And that would be the Z259.11 Standard. What's interesting about that standard is it brought into effect a new classification. Can't even call it actually a classification because there was only one energy absorber at the time, but now it introduces a classification of energy absorbers. Now, as I mentioned, this has been in the books now for approximately 10 years now, and actually in the field for 8 to 9 years, but I don't think it's actually understood and applied because from a distribution standpoint, there's virtually no requests for these E6 energy absorbers, which I will be discussing later. And I think it's important to understand why CSA went about introducing this classification of standards, classification of energy absorbers, rather. So we'll discuss that in this first standard. In the second standard, which is the Z259.2.2, we'll be talking about, this is our standard which addresses self-retracting devices. And we published a new edition of the standard in 2014, and what's important to note while I'm talking, just bear in mind while I'm talking throughout this process in regards to this standard. This standard, the edition is published, but not into effect. So what I'm saying basically is that we've published this new standard, and CSA, for technical difficulties, especially when it comes to test equipment and test criteria, have not been able to functionally test, so they can't test product to this standard. So they're working out the problems and their challenges with this standard, and I'll bring you through that. But I think we can benefit from these new and innovative equipment that are coming into our marketplace. So that's basically what I want to do. I want to go through a relatively old standard and a new standard and just bring to you these changes to these standards. As I mentioned, firstly, I'd like to talk about the Z259.11, which addresses energy absorbers. So we'll talk about that one first. Basically, the highlights of this standard, if you were, by very simply, the very first highlight is we actually redefined the equipment that we're using. We've replaced shock absorber by the term energy absorber to better describe the function of this device. An energy absorber, in essence, what it's there to do is dissipate or reduce the kinetic energy created when an individual falls. What kinetic energy is, in essence, is it's the energy of movement. When a mass moves, that movement creates energy, and it's called kinetic energy. So it's the energy of movement. So when somebody falls, obviously he's creating a lot of kinetic energy through actually falling. So we'll discuss exactly about these energy absorbers, and we added and created a classification where we created a heavyweight, if you were, classification for energy absorbers. And this, again, is to better reflect the various weights and weight classes or weight range, if you were, of the workers using them. So I often say that we're a population that's growing, and I don't mean that in a demographic sense, but more or less around the waist sense, if you follow me. Well, unfortunately, we're a population that is becoming increasingly heavy overall. So if you take that context, this demographic context, and place it into a fall protection environment, obviously we have to make sure that our equipment have that performance criteria to address these changes when it comes to the energy absorber. So that's the notion and the basis behind this creation of an energy absorber classification. Presenting here just basically the table, and this introduced you to the specifications of each energy absorber class. If you look at the first class on your left, which has the designation E4, E is in fact for energy, and 4 is addressing basically the maximum arresting force that is basically recognized for that weight class, which is 4 kilonewton or 900 pounds. So what we're talking about is a classification who addresses individuals that we're talking about a weight capacity from 100 to 254 pounds. Now we have to realize when we talk about capacity, we're talking about the individual, his work clothes, his boots, his tool belt, his tools, everything that we're asking our fall protection equipment to arrest in a fall and then suspend and hold in place at the end of the fall. So we have to understand when we're talking about capacity, it's not just the weight of the individual, in fact. If you look at the test mass, we're using a 100 kilogram or 225-pound mannequin, and we're drop testing that mannequin with a free fall of 1.8 meters or 6 feet, if you were. You'll notice when we're talking about maximum arresting forces, you see MAF, maximum arresting forces. In fact, these are the forces that the body has to absorb when they come to a complete fall or an arrest. So as you can see, it's variable. We talk about in a dry environment of 4 kilonewtons, 900 pounds, which is associated with the designation of the class. but you'll see that maximum arresting forces, in fact, vary with the environment in which you're using your equipment. So in the wintertime, the energy, the maximum arresting force could be a little bit higher because we're working in a cold or a frozen environment. So in fact, maximum arresting force is actually a variable. It's not something that's necessarily static. And it has to do, again, with kinetic energy, weight of the individual, and environment. So that we have to understand is in essence a little bit variable. The really key thing when you're looking at energy absorbers, too, to understand is elongation. And what elongation is basically, it's your, if I can describe it this way, your braking distance. This is the distance where you're going to slow down, you're going to dissipate this kinetic energy, and come to a stop. So in other words, you don't come to an abrupt stop, but the energy is dissipated and you gradually come to a stop. So it's basically a deceleration distance. If you look at the Class E6, you'll notice right away capacity is totally different. We're talking about 200 pounds up to 386 pounds. And you'll see to do that, we use a larger test mass. We're talking about 160 kilogram mannequin, and again, drop testing or free falling from a height of 6 feet. So you notice that the maximum arresting forces are slightly higher right from the beginning. You see the E6, obviously the 6 being the 6 kilonewton designations, or 1,300 pounds. And then again, the maximum arresting forces are going to vary again because of the mass, kinetic energy, and the environmental factors. So that's why we have a bit of a variable when it comes to maximum arresting forces. You'll notice throughout this that in essence our standards require that we arrest the maximum arresting forces can be no higher than 8 kilonewtons or 1,800 pounds. So that's the maximum. Again, notice elongation. We're talking about 1.75 meters, and we'll round it off to 5.5 feet, basically. So you'll notice more mass, more kinetic energy, longer deceleration distance. So this is really important when we're talking about a population of workers and making sure that each individual has the equipment that's adequately going to perform for him in regards to weight class, et cetera, to ensure that he benefits fully from the protection of these energy absorbers. This is a fall clearance distance chart. Probably most of you have already seen one, but it's always important to go back and really understand what we're talking about in essence when we're talking about a fall clearance distance, to fully understand why sometimes you look at and we're not understanding how the system really fully functions. In essence, there's 4 variables. You'll see that there's a number of variables written into this diagram, but in essence, we're talking about 4 elements. First of all is the length of your connecting device. So essentially, if we're talking about a lanyard, you have to come to that complete length of the lanyard before anything happens, before you start to your energy absorber deploys and you start to dissipate that kinetic energy. So we have to understand we have to come to the complete length of that lanyard. So if we use this example, for instance, in essence, we're talking about the use of a 6-foot lanyard. So nothing's going to happen until we come to that 6-foot length, and then our system starts to perform for us. Maximum elongation or deceleration distance is going to depend, again, on the type of energy absorber you'll be using. So in this case, we use, for an example, an Efore energy absorber. So we're talking about, in fact, a maximum elongation of rounded off to 3.5 feet. Afterwards, some manufacturers will present it this way: the height measured to the worker's harness back D-ring, and then we'll go from the harness stretch sliding back D-ring movement. But if you combine all that, we're basically talking about the height of the individual in essence. So for practical purposes in this example, we'll say that our worker is 6 foot tall. The other element that's really important is a safety factor. We always want to have that buffer, that safety factor between us and the lower level on which we could fall. that safety factor is important just to make sure that even if we miscalculate somewhat, we still have that buffer of protection for us. So if you combine what I've just described to you, basically, length of the lanyard is 6 foot in this example. We're using an Efore shock absorber, so we'll talk about an elongation distance of 3.5 feet. We'll talk about a 6-foot worker, and we'll talk about a safety factor of 3 feet, which is, I would say, basically standard for what we do when we talk about fall clearance. So it's basically math, 9.5 plus 9, we come up with a required fall clearance of 18.5 feet. So that means from that anchor point, which is the small D-ring located on the upper beam, to the lower level is what's required if we're using a 6-foot lanyard. So you see, basically, we have 4 elements, 2 that are variable, meaning the length of the connecting device, the elongation of the shock absorber or the energy absorber, pardon me, which is again variable depending on which classification you're using, and then the other elements are static, that being the worker's height and the safety factor.
Thank you, Bruce. And that being said, I think it's a good timing for questions to ensure that we all understand that concept. So I'm going to read the question, and you have on your screen the question as well as the answer, so you can actually answer on your screen. What is the fall distance for a worker using a 6-foot lanyard with a type E6 energy absorber? I'm just going to give you some time to answer the question.
I've actually flipped back onto that, the fall clearance distance chart, just to give you an idea. Remember what our elements, our 4 basic elements are, 2 that are variable and 2 that are static. So if you read the question, there's the variable that's changed.
Okay. We'll now look at the answer. Well, we have 100% of people who answer B.
They're all wrong. No, I'm just joking. No, you're absolutely correct. So what's happened in this is that obviously the variable element that's changed is in fact our maximum elongation distance. So we've actually gone from a 3.5 foot distance to a 5.5 foot distance. So you're absolutely correct. That's great. So if we go back to this example, if we had a worker actually working in this position, we want him looking at an anchor point 2 feet above what's illustrated in this example. So that's in fact correct. So we have to, it's not necessarily difficult. 4 variables, 4 elements, 2 variables, 2 fixes, and it's not that complicated afterwards. So I use this example a lot to describe braking or deceleration distance, and I think it's a good idea. It's a good illustration to exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about dissipating kinetic energy. If you look at my top example, we're driving a small sports car, relatively light vehicle. We bring it up to 100 kilometers an hour, and we apply the brakes. So what's going to happen is we've created kinetic energy in movement. We have that vehicle that's gone up to a speed of 100 kilometers, and we've applied the brakes. So what we're going to do now is create a braking distance or a deceleration distance before we come to a complete stop. So what's happened is we've got that distance, so the vehicle comes to a complete stop. My other example is we'll take a truck. So you can understand what I'm trying to go through is an E4 versus an E6. I got a truck, and I'm bringing that truck up, an F250, F350, whatever, and I'm bringing that vehicle up to that 100-kilometer speed limit, and I'm applying the brakes. Obviously, larger mass, more energy, more kinetic energy is created. What's going to happen? That braking distance before I come to a complete stop is going to be much longer than my small, light sports car. So that's basically, if I can give you an example of how an E4 and an E6 energy absorber works, basically. So it's a good analogy if you use a vehicle to describe braking distance, kinetic energy, et cetera, and dissipating that energy. I'd like to introduce to you a new product that's just come out on the market, which I find pretty neat. Is basically what Honeywell through their Miller and North branded products, have created what we call a hybrid lanyard. And what's really neat about this product is they've actually combined in the same shock energy absorber, both a Class E4 and a Class E6 designation. So what's neat about this product is you're removing all the guesswork. You don't have to go through the population of your workers and, you know, that indiscreet question is how much do you weigh, how much this, how much that. It takes away the worries, too, that are we actually using the right energy absorber for our workers, et cetera. So the idea of fusing these two classifications into one energy absorber, is a really neat idea in my view. So I'd like just to show you a brief video of this new product, and it'll give you an idea of some of the information that I've just given to you as well. So you noticed that the video was very interesting. Again, an interesting and innovative product. We're talking about, obviously, shock energy absorbers on lanyards. You know, lanyards are still an integral part of fall protection equipment. It's still one of the most popular connecting devices in use. So the introduction of this new energy absorber, this fusion-style energy absorber, is a really neat concept, I think, for those that are still using lanyards for their fall protection. The second standard that I want to talk to you about is a standard that was, as you can see, Z259.2.2. The 14 is the designation of the year. In other words, 2014. CSA went and published a brand new edition of our self-retracting devices, so our self-retracting lifelines. Major changes to this CSA standard. Published standard, our challenge, or the CSA people, what their challenge is right now, is they don't have the test apparatus to actually physically test equipment to this new criteria. So we have a CSA standard, basically, which is on hold. We're waiting for CSA to move forward, addressing this challenge they have with testing equipment. So basically, the highlights of this new CSA standard: we have a new classification of self-retracting devices, and this new classification is more or less predicated on their method of use. If you remember, and we'll look at it in a few minutes, the old classification of our CSA standards, CSA self-retracting lifelines, you'll notice that it's quite different, in fact. And remember, when I'm going through this standard, just keep in mind that this actually isn't in place at this moment, but we know it's in future. This is what our self-retracting devices will look like. So basically, new classification, and also reviews dispositions for qualitative testing, as I mentioned, and that's a challenge right now. But there's also differences when it comes to the design criteria and recertification of self-retracting devices. So if we look at the standards before and after version, if you were, and please understand that what's on the left, 1998, is still what is in fact in effect in regards to the CSA standard for these type of equipment. So we have a type 1, which is basically an overall length of 5 to 10 feet, or if you prefer 1.5 to 3 meters. Your energy absorber on these units can be internal or external, and the difference being the external energy absorber will look exactly like the energy absorber that we saw when we were discussing lanyards, or internally, that means it can be inside the housing as part of the braking mechanism of the unit. A type 2 essentially is anything over 10 feet. So anything over 3 meters we consider to be a type 2 self-retracting lifeline. Again, for the most part, internal energy absorber, but some units will have external energy absorbers as well. And the type 3, well, again, it's just a type 2. In other words, an overall length of over 10 feet, but with the particularity that it has that retrieval mechanism. So it has that retrieval handle on it so that we can actually change our self-retracting lifeline into a winch and lower or ascend an individual off the self-retracting lifeline. If we look at what we're going to be doing under this new standard, is we're actually going to, again, the designation is going to be predicated on its use, in fact. So we're going to still have 3 categories, 4th maybe as well, but essentially 3 categories. So we'll see SRL, which is for self-retracting lifeline, and that qualification for that self-retracting lifeline designation is going to be the unit can't be anchored lower than the back D-ring and be exposed to sharp edges. And the sharp edges designation, we'll discuss this in a few moments, but obviously it's an SRL that cannot be positioned lower than the back D-ring on the safety harness. So anything obviously above shoulder height, in other words. The other designation is SRL-R. Again, it's an SRL, but it has that retrieval mechanism. So in essence, an SRL-R is our old Type 3 in essence. And the really neat or new innovation to the CSA standard is the creation of SRL-LE for leading edges. And these are devices that can actually be anchored lower than the D-ring on the back and be exposed to sharp edges. So they really address a specific requirement when we're talking about fall protection. Now, what's neat about these leading edge equipment is ANSI actually brought this into effect a number of years ago. So leading edge is part of their criteria in their ANSI standard for fall protection on self-retracting lifelines. So in other words, what we're doing with our CSA standard, we're trying to align it a little more with what our our friends in the States are doing when it comes to designations and classifications of self-retracting lifelines.
Right, thank you, Bruce. So let's look at a second question together. Following the proposed changes, the self-retracting devices approved according to the previous standard revision must be replaced. Is that a true or false statement? Again, you have the question on your screen and you can answer. I'm just receiving the answers right now. Okay, we will now look at the results. We have 75 people that think it is false and 25 people that think it is true. Bruce?
Well, in fact, it's false. Normally, equipment that has been certified to an old edition of the standard is equipment that can still be put into use, unless, of course, there has been a modification of the standard which that there's a danger that was perceived, there was essentially a problem with the equipment, then that equipment would be taken out of the marketplace. But with most changes like this, the old standard remains in place and the equipment remains in place throughout their work life, if I can explain it that way. And once they're out of commission, out of service, well, then they will be replaced with equipment that obviously meets this new standard. So in fact, the equipment will remain in place and will just be cycled out through their existing work life for the most part. So we're talking about these introduction of sharp edges and talking about leading edges, etc. Just by definition, sharp edges, for practical purposes, is basically anything that's not rounded. So, you know, you can think of all types of applications. You're doing steel decking on a roof. You're working off I-beams, etc., where you can expose your webbing or your cable to that edge of the beam, etc. So you can visualize what a sharp edge would look like. So obviously, when we're talking about sharp edge 2, we're actually talking creating an angle into our webbing or into our cable product, and you'll see that in greater detail later. But essentially, if you want to define sharp edges, is an edge that's not rounded, and obviously you're exposing standard webbing or standard cable in a self-retracting lifeline, you may obviously create a hazard with that, especially, you know, with a swing hazard or anything else when it's rubbing along the I-beam or something like that. So you're obviously chafing and could create where the webbing would just give out, exposing to that sharp edge. Leading edge is in fact a very good example. Is working on a flat or close to a flat roof, basically, and you can imagine you have an anchor point and you're moving out and away from that anchor point, and you're exposing yourself to the risk hazard which is on that edge or that leading edge. So in fact, what's happening is if you fall in this position, you're actually creating two energy points, if I can describe it that way. You obviously are going to have energy off of your anchor point, but you're also going to be creating energy on that line, on that second point where it's in contact with that leading edge. So these products are actually conceived, obviously, to help attenuate the energy created at the anchor point, the kinetic energy there, but also creating that ability to attenuate the energy which is created on that leading edge point as well. So that's, in essence, the nature and the idea behind the conception of these types of equipment. And like I said, they've been on the market in the States for a couple of years. You can actually purchase them in Canada, but you'll purchase them under the existing SRL designations, in other words, the existing Type 1, Type 2, Type 3 designations. Well, I just have a brief video which is really interesting in regards to these products, and you'll understand better their applications. As you can see during the video, it's really some interesting products, and they're addressing some really particular work hazards or work situations we have. Again, we're talking about metal workers, et cetera, and whatnot. So what's really neat is these equipment are available right now. They're just not under, I guess I could say, their appropriate designation at this point. I've just illustrated a number of equipment options that we have out there. So you look at Miller has products, DBI obviously has the products. If you take a look at the self-retracting lifelines on your left, the Miller unit and the ultra-lock from DBI, you can understand how they're actually going about this. Obviously, the braking mechanism or the blocking mechanism that's in the housing, that's really there to attenuate that kinetic energy created at the anchor point. And you can understand what they've done. They've actually added a second energy absorber to attenuate that energy created on that leading edge point. And by attenuating that energy, well, that's creating or lessening the potential for that cable to shear off or that webbing product to shear off. So the nano lock, the items on the right, upper right, really neat product. Again, it's the concept is two energy absorbers in there, one located in the unit, one located in the backpack on both sides. So again, notion is to attenuate that energy on both points. So really neat products, really innovative products. We can purchase them here in our Canadian market. They're just not going to be under, at this point, under that the new CSA designation until we get things sorted out with the test apparatus and the testing.
We will not take your questions, so just feel free to write some in the Q&A section of this screen if you do have some question. And I have one that is very interesting now with Bruce. Because the Class E6 energy absorber has a higher weight capacity, many believe that if they use this option for all applications and people, they will be protected. Is that true?
No, absolutely. That's false. It's non-conformant to CSA standards as well. And again, it all goes back to that notion of kinetic energy and dissipating that energy. So you use a person that's 110, 115 pounds, and you'd use an E6 energy absorber. What's happening is you're not creating enough kinetic energy. You don't have the mass to create enough kinetic energy to actually adequately deploy the energy absorber. So what's going to happen is you're going to stop. That's for sure. That's a given. But what happens is you're going to have your maximum arresting forces way up higher in a range above where you'd like them to protect the individual. So basically what's happening is you're running the risk of injury because the maximum arresting force are much higher. So no, in fact, you don't want to do that. You want to have people wearing the appropriate energy absorber classification.
We will take another question here. Are all types of energy absorbers, those being pack style or tubular, come into both EA and E6 classes?
Well, in fact, what we've seen in the marketplace now, and a pack style, tubular style, there's two different types of energy absorbers, and the pack style is actually the one that we have now in the marketplace in an E6. So if your workforce are using tubular type shock absorbers and lanyards, unfortunately, if you're going over or want to be using a E6 designation, you have to move over to a pack style energy absorber.
Okay, so we are currently running out of time right now. I will suggest everyone, if you have more questions about this topic, just feel free to communicate with us by phone or by email at communication@spi-s.com, or you have the phone number there. Also, I would like to thank each and every one for your participation. The PowerPoint as well as the webinar will be available after. We will send you a link by email. And I would like also to thank our guest speaker, Bruce, for taking the time to discuss fall protection with us. When leaving this presentation, we invite you to fill out the feedback survey, which appears in your internet browser. Your comments and feedback will be greatly appreciated. This concludes today's presentation. We hope you enjoy it and found it helpful. Thanks for your time, and we look forward for your participation in a future webinar.